So Trump's defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, announced recently that Ukraine is not going to get back the territories that it lost to Russia. Russia is going to be allowed to keep those territories under a peace deal, and that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO. Now, this goes completely against what NATO have been saying over the past year about Ukraine's potential NATO membership. And more importantly, a lot of people are up in arms about this because they're saying, first of all, Ukraine should have a seat at this negotiating table, Europe should have a say in this, and that it's not right that Ukraine is going to permanently lose that territory. It's their territory, they should get it back. I think what I find interesting about this is how European leaders are talking about Europe needing a say in this. This just exposes to Europe and to the rest of the world that when you live under the hegemon of US empire, or any empire really, that ultimately you are beholden to them. You're essentially a vassal state in this sort of US empire. And honestly, countries in Europe are that. Yes, we're all members of NATO, but at the end of the day, most of us do not contribute the required minimum amount to NATO in terms of defense spending. The US military power and economic power is what underpins NATO. And even in the case of Ukraine, it's the US that as a country has given the most military aid to Ukraine. People group all the European countries together and say Europe as a whole has given money, but I think that's a bit of a fallacious comparison because European countries do not function as a single unit. The closest thing you have to that is the EU, which doesn't even include all the European countries. But even for the EU, the aid they've given to Ukraine mostly was not military aid. It's the US that has been helping the Ukraine from a military standpoint. So the US absolutely has the leverage in this matter, because if the US pulls out from helping Ukraine, the EU is simply not going to be able to ramp up as quickly with that military assistance. And herein lies the main problem. If the EU, or if Europe, let's say, wants to have a bigger say at this negotiating table, then it needed to have stepped up with more money, more military aid, and just more strength earlier on for Ukraine. And to be honest, generally speaking, again, Europe has spent decades now living under the umbrella of American hegemony, and Europeans always like to bitch and whine about America not fulfilling its obligations and promises, but at the end of the day, the way I see it, I want European countries, especially Britain, my country, to be sovereign nations, to not be dependent on the US for military assistance or for defense, right? We should be able to defend ourselves. We should have a strong military. We should have a strong economy. And if we had those things, then it would be a true alliance of equal partners. I mean, of course, America's a superpower. It's a massive country. We're never going to equal their military might. But we don't need to. We just need enough military might to defend our own interests, right? Which I think we could have. I think Britain can have it, France can have it, because these are nuclear powers. The other countries in Europe probably couldn't have it, but that's where Europe needs to band together and have essentially a European NATO, right? So a NATO, but it's European. If you think about NATO, it was set up in the first place to combat the Soviet Union. So the purpose of NATO was really to protect Europe, because Europe's going to bear the brunt of any kind of Soviet attack. I mean, back in the day, right? It's not before it hits America, really, unless we're talking about ICBMs. But yeah, NATO is really about protecting Europe. And Europe should protect Europe, but Europe and European countries then need to step up. They need to just change the way they think about this. You cannot live under the umbrella of American hegemony and then complain when America doesn't do what you want, right? America's going to elect a president. They are going to put their own interests first, as any country would. And so sometimes they're going to do things that you don't agree with. And you can't complain about it because you're essentially in the form of a vassal state. You rely on them so much. If they pull out of NATO, NATO is just simply going to dissolve. So you're not in a situation where you have leverage in this negotiation. Of course, people can complain, people can say things, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's that outrageous that America is taking unilateral decisions like this. As for Ukraine, I feel really sorry for Ukraine. I mean, they've been led down the garden path. They've been led astray. They've been made to believe that they were going to join NATO. And honestly, the time to really help Ukraine was when this whole invasion started. When Russia first invaded and Ukraine said, look, we need tanks, we need fighter jets. We should have given them everything at that point in time. because that was the point in time where they had the maximum ability to repel the invasion and to get their territory back. Now they've just lost so many men to the fighting, as is Russia, by the way, and it's going to be hard for them to replenish that. And we're simply, now we're giving them military assistance, even though it's still got limits, but it's simply not going to be enough now. It's simply not going to be enough, and Ukraine's already just taken such a battering as a country. So I think we didn't help them back then when we should have, because we were afraid of kicking off World War III. But in the end, we gave them the weapons they asked for, despite that fears, which tells me that we could have helped them. And if we had just taken that chance and just had a more muscular response at that time, I think it would have resulted in a different outcome. But now it's too late. I think signing a peace deal is the right solution, because the fighting has to stop, people have to stop dying. And I think, unfortunately for Ukraine, they're just going to have to accept the losses of territory. As for people worried that this emboldens Russia, I think Russia needs to heal its economy. They need to rebuild their military power. They've taken a bit of a battering as well. So they're not going to immediately start invading other territories. That's at least not my belief. But in any case, whether Russia would invade or wouldn't invade, the point is that the fighting cannot go on. And European ministers suggesting that Europe can keep helping Ukraine defend itself and Europe can keep funding the war are just deluded. They're just, they're not going to be willing to put that money into it. Now, if Europe shifts into war stance and ups its production levels and really dedicates itself to this, then yeah, it could happen. But European economies aren't exactly thriving right now. So I don't really see that happening. And I just don't think it's realistic at the end of the day. The other thing I'll say is that this is a clear indicator, if any, to Europe that the world has changed. It's time to build a European defense force. It's time for Europe to take its defense into its own hands and be responsible for it. It's time to up defense spending, and it's time to build those economies, make strong economies, and really start thinking as sovereign nations, right? You have to be able to protect yourself. Now, some countries like Estonia and Latvia, really small countries, are simply not going to be able to do that. But then again, they're in the EU, right? So there's an opportunity to do an EU-based defense force. Countries outside the EU, well, they're just going to have to go at it themselves, really. Maybe there can be a European defense force they can join. But for Britain, at least, I think Britain, we've got the talent, we've got the hardware, we've got the defense manufacturing and the legacy and the history to really be able to defend ourselves. And I want to see Britain do that. I think it's good to have the alliance with America, but really want us to have sovereign capability. We've got the aircraft carriers. I mean, let's build that back out. Let's really build that back out so that we can start making unilateral decisions on the world stage in terms of foreign policy.